This evening's program was inspired by a discussion that started on the Google group Design and User Research. A woman named Wendy Castleman asked the question, how do you present yourself, or what kind of portfolio pieces do you have that you feel show off well, and what would you look for? And it started a good discussion, and it was only about a week ago, I think, right? Well, I noticed, that the scheduled speaker had to postpone her visit with us. We'll see her later this year. But that meant we had an opening. And B, I thought, this is very topical. It's getting a lot of discussion on the list. I keep hearing other people. I'm reading all these articles about portfolios. Let's focus on careers and portfolios and not just about technique. So, among those who responded were Sarah Cambridge, who you're going to hear from shortly, and Colin Swindells, who you'll also hear from briefly. And Smita, my co-chair, said, well, I have something I'd like to show. What do you think of this? So I said, let's all talk about this. This will be great stimulus for a discussion among all of us. And that's the motivation for this meeting, and I'm delighted to see all of you turn out for it. Please come join me and up here. And Sarah, why don't you start us off? Sarah actually taught a course, a whole course about making portfolios, and she's going to give us a very abbreviated section on that. And Colin and Smita, if you would join me over here, and then you can show off your work in a minute. And you are already
I think I'm good, right? Can you guys hear me? It's all good? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Nancy and Bekai, for hosting us. This is really exciting thing to be able to share. It's something that's really close to my heart, as you'll hear a little bit about my story as well. So I just want to point out that I do have a tinyurl.com for this deck. If you want to access it later, it's tinyurl.com/greatUXportfolio. And I also just want to say that that this is part of this comes out of a class that Nancy mentions that I taught, but I'm also, this is kind of my take on portfolios and how I teach it to my students, but there are so many different perspectives and approaches to portfolios. So I'm really excited to hear what other people have to say, and also what you folks, what your experience is, and what you have to say about portfolios as well. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to be chatting about. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about portfolios in the context of their use, which is the job search process. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and why this matters to me, and then I'm going to go over the basics. This kind of stuff is coming out of my class, is kind of what a portfolio is, what its goal is, and the role of storytelling in your portfolio, and then my 6-step process for creating a great case study, and then I will very briefly skim through one of my the project for my graduate school, my thesis project in the portfolio, just to show you my own work. So let's back up. We're here to talk about portfolios, but just think a little bit about the context of use that a portfolio is for, and that is, of course, the job search. So I would just love to hear you guys kind of yell out a word that comes to your mind when you're thinking about looking for a job. Opportunity, okay. What else? Overwhelmed, okay. Any other? Confusion. Confidentiality, right. Okay. Okay, any other final thoughts? Anybody want to throw anything else out? Marketing, okay. Yeah, those are all great comments. Say again? Self-presentation, okay, all key parts of it. Well, for me, the word that most comes to mind is stressful. It is so stressful looking for a job. And so I did a little research, and I found some research that shows that the only two things more stressful than looking for a job are breaking up in a relationship or the death of a loved one. And I definitely relate to this. So 83% of the people who responded to this survey said that they find looking for a job to be somewhat or very stressful. And so then what I did is I was like, well, let me do an image search about what it's like to look for a job. And these are the images that came up. So apparently you have to be holding your head in your hand when you're looking for a job. But, I had a year-long job search that was, to me, a job search is really, there's a lot of insecurities that come up. Imposter syndrome is something I hear a lot about from my students, and it's certainly something I struggled with a lot when I was looking for a job. You're being judged, you're being rejected, you're looking at this list of skills they're asking for, you're like, I only have a fraction of those. So it's a very difficult situation, and it can be very trying. So I just want to kind of put the context that, that's what's so tricky about portfolios. It's part of it. It's about how do I package my work, and part of this larger process that is just one of the most vulnerable things you can do in your professional life is to be looking for jobs. So now we've got that context, let's talk a little bit about the role of portfolios in the job search process. So this was the experience I went through when I was looking for a job a couple years ago. I'd hear about a job, I would submit a cover letter in my portfolio, I would maybe have a call with HR, I'd have a call with the hiring manager, I would come in for an in-person interview, and then I would get the rejection or the offer. And when I was initially thinking about this, I was like, okay, the portfolio is just an early stage thing that comes up in the interview process. But then when I was kind of thinking about it, I realized it actually is really so present in the entire interview process, because everybody that you're interviewing is seeing your portfolio if you have one. So that's what their references for their work, for your work. They're going to be asking about it. And usually we do our deepest thinking about our projects with the things that we have in our portfolio. So we're talking about them. So it's really integral to the entire interview process. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. I was a graphic designer for a decade, and I went to grad school, and I ended up moving into research. I spent a few years at a small research consultancy, and then I had my year-long job search. And, it was just made sense to me as a designer. I always had a portfolio. So I had a portfolio. That's the first thing I did when I finished grad school is I had a portfolio, made a portfolio. So I just want to point out my stats for my year-long job search. So I had 17 applications, and I had 15 interviews. And I think that is probably a pretty high number. And I credit a lot of that to having a portfolio that I always submitted. But on the other hand, I had just 4 in-person interviews, and I only got 1 offer. So, it was still a really long, arduous process. And what I realized is I was self-employed as a designer. I'd never really had to look very hard for a job. So I had a lot to learn about the interview process and about storytelling. So even though I had a pretty strong portfolio, there was still a lot to learn. So to me, this is all kind of one big messy thing. The portfolio, how you present yourself, and I think some of these kind of terms came up when we were talking about words. It's all kind of one big thing. So, the offer I got is I'm at Google. I work on material design. So I mostly interview designers and developers about their work processes. But the other piece of this is, as I mentioned, is that I've just finished teaching a storytelling for your UX portfolio class at UC Berkeley. So that's where a lot of the content that you're hearing tonight is kind of coming out of my thinking for that class. So the basics for portfolios, for me, the way I define a portfolio is that it's a case study. It's a collection of case studies that showcases 3 things. It talks about your experience, which is what you've actually done, your process, which is how you go about solving problems, and then your abilities, which is your core strengths and the skills that are relative to wherever you're at in your career. And one of these questions is like, how does the portfolio change early career versus mid-career? So for me, and I just finished, I've been kind of hiring for a role, so I've just kind of gone through this myself, looking at portfolios and kind of thinking, especially for people who are early stage, like, I want to know, do you understand the processes that are used? And of course, I'm hiring now for researchers, but I think it's the same for designers. Do you understand the processes? Can you talk about why those processes matter? And can you articulate the decisions that you made? Whereas mid-career, and this is what I was struggling with in my last job search, is, can you drive impact? And I was coming from a consultancy looking to go in-house, and it was tricky to figure out how to talk about the impact when I couldn't really talk about the details of my work. But also it was just about learning what were the alternate signals that I could share that were around the success of my work. So, and then as somebody's more advanced in their career, or they're going to be kind of thinking about with their portfolio is, how do I tell the other stories, the more complicated stories, like how I built a team, or as somebody mentioned to me before, like how I, a project that didn't pan out as expected, but was still delivered very important findings. So the way I've kind of teased out the content that goes into portfolios is there's two buckets. One is the structure, and this is what people expect to see, because it's basically a narrative structure of a portfolio. You need to kind of have an intro, so a little bit of an overview, and then you're talking about your process and some of your key decisions, and then you have an endpoint where you talk about the outcome or what your final deliverable was. So that's kind of what people expect to see, or a format. But the other piece is your own narrative, and this is where it's really whatever your story turns out to be is what happens here. And this is what's kind of magical and mysterious and frustrating about portfolios, is you have to figure that out. How are you going to frame this project that you did? What do you have to say about it? And this is what your job is to uncover this narrative. Now, this is something that really surprised me a little bit with my own process, is especially when I was doing the project I'm going to show you, which was the first thing in my portfolio, my thesis project. As I was working on the portfolio, I was realizing, oh, this was the driving philosophy of our whole project. And this is the thing that kind of ended up being the biggest challenge for us. And it's things that you don't necessarily know when you're living through it, what they ended up meaning. But when you reflect on it is when the things fall into place. So I love this quote from John Dewey: "We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." And so this was my process when I was building my portfolios or my case studies, but I also saw it in my students. Like, they'd come in and I'd have them starting to write about a project they finished, and it really was that process of writing that made them realize, oh, this was the thing that went wrong that I was able to kind of come in and fix and make the project more successful. And a very similar quote from Sarah Doody, who's a designer, and she has a great blog post around, or a couple of them, I think, actually, about the role of writing in designers. And it's about helping us learn how to communicate more effectively. And that is truly a lifelong skill for any of us. So when you have the structure and the narrative together, what you have is a good story, and that is really compelling. So here's like what I kind of mentioned before. You've got the format I always recommend with portfolios is start with an overview that kind of talks about the scope and gives a synopsis, then go into the middle part, which your process, your key decisions, some of your high and low points, and end with some of the learnings or the outcomes. And what's really exciting is when you can really pull out where things went wrong or they went well, because it's the drama that really is engaging for people. So my favorite story structure is The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. I'm guessing somebody knows what movie was using The Hero's Journey. Anybody want to yell that out? Star Wars. Oh, you guys know. Awesome. I actually just read that George Lucas met Joseph Campbell, and actually they were close friends. So that was kind of cool to read. But anyway, I think the hero's journey is a perfect structure to use for any kind of project, because it's the person getting called to adventure, going into the unknown, having failures, dying, being reborn, given powers, and re-entering a changed person into the normal world. And if that does not describe every major project you've ever had, I love this. And what I love about the hero's journey is it also really calls out the importance of the failures. And this is one thing that I certainly have struggled with. And I saw my students like, oh, they would never put in anything that went wrong in a project in their portfolio. And I'm like, that's where it gets really interesting, because of course, when you talk about what went wrong, you talk about how you solved it, and you show that you can learn from your mistakes. And, we all, I know, kind of like to pretend that we don't make mistakes, but when anybody is being hired for a job, things go wrong every day at my job. And, it's a matter of how quickly can you recover from something that went wrong. That is a very important superpower in the workplace. So here's, getting back to the more tactical stuff, here's my checklist of a great case study. It's going to begin with a really brief overview of the challenge or the goals. There's a lot of skimming that happens when kind of the early stages at companies around people reviewing your portfolio. So I think it's critical to have a really nice brief overview that somebody can get a sense. Focus on your process and your thinking. Highlight a couple of key moments that move the project forward. Don't highlight everything, just things that were kind of more interesting. Include your authentic struggles, show the final deliverable, and explain the impact. End with your key learnings or what you would do differently. And make sure it is easy to skim and enter at any point, which means, headers and dividers and captions and images. So here now is my 6-step process for making your own case study. So the first thing is I say, find examples you like. I mean, you can borrow from, it's easier to find designers' portfolios online than researchers, but there's a lot of contractors and consultants who have their portfolios online. So even as a researcher, it should not be that hard to find some really interesting case studies. Find something that resonates with you, and then borrow that structure for your own content. Then do a memory dump. Don't worry about writing something really concise. Just write down everything you can remember about the project, including kind of what went wrong and who were your users and how did you recruit and what were the biggest insights and what was the outcome. And then you can kind of come back to that and cull out of it to edit down to create something that's more interesting. The third piece is adding a project overview. I've got this kind of very simple, structure for kind of like making sure you make it really easy for somebody to come in and in one paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences, kind of get the entire picture. They can know, if they want to read any further. And so when you combine this with your edited memory dump, then you've got a first draft, probably kind of a crappy first draft, but that's where you start. And then the key is to get feedback from other people, because we are so close to any project we did that we can't see the holes. So if you take the time to kind of get feedback from a few people you respect and ask those basic research questions, like, what was confusing? What did you like the most? What did you want to learn more about? I promise you that in the time that you spend doing that with 2 or 3 people, you will be so much farther ahead than if you just spin the cycles and do it on your own. Finally, iterate, keep improving, make sure you've, kind of see if you can juice up the drama, kind of be a little more authentic about what went wrong and how you solved it, and then get it online and let it go. This is the thing of some of us, if anybody's a perfectionist in this room, I've seen people spend 6 or 8 months working on a portfolio, and there's just no need to. Just get it up there and move on. So these are all the 6 steps together, and now I'll really briefly walk you through my thesis example. So the blue strip on the right is kind of my notes, and then it was a PDF. And so I'm just pointing out here what's good, because I could not destroy my own portfolio piece, but anyway, and I will say, I can, as you all are thinking, oh, I hate my portfolio. You can imagine how I feel about this one. But anyway, I'm showing it anyway. So the research question is clearly stated: how might sensor technology help heart failure patients better manage their condition? This is a 1-pager synopsis that has kind of everything on it. It's got the methods used, my role, the final deliverable. It's got captions with the images, which is like the first thing I find myself reading when I look at portfolios, is kind of skimming through the captions. So when they're interesting, that's a great start. I was really looking for a job as a researcher, so I've kind of pulled out the research insights, and then I've talked about our guiding principle. I start to kind of pull out, because I was involved in the design process, I pull out and kind of show some of the early mocks and what was not effective about them. And then I pull out our greatest challenges, which I'll read very briefly. Finding heart failure patients to interview was one of our greatest challenges. However, once we did, the insights they provided were invaluable. Their feedback to our prototypes ensured we created an interaction flow that was clear and concise. So I didn't have to go into a lot of detail, just kind of acknowledge it was a struggle. And then the last page was showing the final design mocks and how they were better than the previous ones. And then, I have a success metric. If you have a success metric, that's great. We won an award for my grad program. So again, this is in the deck if you want to come back and take a look at it. But I am excited to see the other folks and how different all these portfolios are. And I think that's the beauty, is like we just add our own story and our own character and personality to them. So I have a couple of additional resources here. I have a longer version of this presentation that includes an exercise that is at Make a Better Portfolio, but I think probably more interesting, if you want to read more about this, there's a collection of readings and videos that I put together for my class. This is a Google Doc. The tinyurl.com UX Portfolio Resources is a Google Doc with lots of some of the most interesting reading that I came across and ideas around portfolios. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I'll pass it over. I did want to say I am absolutely will, if anybody wants to send me their portfolio and wants to get some feedback, it may take me a while to get around to it, but feel free to email me because this is a very, it's hard to ask for help and feedback, but I will give it to you if you ask for it. And then I also have my old grad school website. I left it up just, for if it has anything of interest. It doesn't have my complete portfolio on it, but it's got some work examples and that kind of stuff. So
Wow.
that's my story.
Wow, that was great. Thank you. And fast. Thank you. And I left my phone sitting over. Can you not hear me? We're good. They're all mic'd. They're all mic'd. It's just me. And if I don't have my phone, I don't have my notes, and I don't have my Twitter account. I hope you're all tweeting a lot. Next, I'm going to ask Colin to go up and talk to us about some of the decisions he made as he anticipated finding a job.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. So I'd like to just touch on some challenges that I struggled with, so hopefully contrast. Sarah's given a great introduction. So one of the considerations that came up a lot was, okay, my work is confidential. I've signed all these NDAs. How do I deal with that? So I just, some ways I've dealt with that in the past is being proactive as I could. So one thing I often did was tie up with marketing departments, sales departments. If there's a trade show, go with these folks and get a little bit of collateral. One thing I noticed, your case studies were very, I guess, several pages long. So one thing to deal with confidentiality I try to do is, a lot of my examples are actually shorter, and that's to try to deal with the confidentiality. So if I had a little bit of marketing collateral from that had already been okayed for release, then I could sort of have that and a little bit extra text, and that was kind of good enough to sort of set the stage and get me to the next step where I could converse with someone in an interview, etc. And this kind of works in both large and small companies. So it's kind of we described. If it's a large company, there's usually some sort of established process. If it's a small company, then you can usually leverage someone to say, okay, come on, just let me release this a little bit. One other thing I struggled with and still trying to deal with is a photo. For example, especially like West Coast versus East Coast, one's more formal, one's versus casual. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer, but it's just something that's still kind of figuring out what's the most appropriate. And I guess we've been focusing more on research versus graphic design. I've purposely tried to not do much of graphic design because I don't really have much of a background in visual design, graphics, etc. So just trying to keep something simple and then just not expose mistakes, even if I try the best or work with a graphic designer is probably not going to impress someone who I'm interviewing with who has a more traditional graphic design background. So I remember seeing some advice on that. Just don't try to apologize and just don't go over there. So that's kind of one of the ways to deal with that. In terms of, I guess, location and target location and immigration came up, especially immigrant to America, and I've been looking for jobs with a company in England too. So even simple things like spelling, I'm trying to think, okay, where, I was like, well, I'm predominantly looking for the Bay Area, so it's kind of possibly choose a dominant location and kind of focus on that location. I formerly lived in Vancouver, and I was thinking, okay, how accepting is someone from Vancouver onto a portfolio that uses kind of the common lingo, et cetera, in the Bay Area? And it's like, well, I think someone in Vancouver probably more accepting of the Bay Area than vice versa. So there's no right or wrong answer. This sort of will be for each person, but it's kind of a challenge that came up of placement and what would be most accepting, and just choosing one that'll probably work for that time at hand. One thing I've heard a lot here is like the term Stanford Mafia and trying to thinking about that. So I thought, well, that's one thing I worried about. It's okay, my degrees and background aren't from the Bay Area, so in terms of presenting and doing things around Stanford, Berkeley, et cetera, it's something to try to maybe gain some exposure. So it's something I thought about of how to be more accepted here and show integration in the culture that I'm targeting. In terms of order and chronologically, should it be in a chronological order versus how to kind of organize? I've moved around a lot, so I kind of wanted to figure out how to kind of deal with that, and I purposely stayed away from chronological presentation of information, kind of like a resume. And Another thing that came up a fair bit was, I guess, focusing versus pigeonholing myself. So I wanted the portfolio to be broad enough to be applicable to many different potential employers, et cetera, but also narrow and focused enough. And I actually went back and forth a lot more than one would expect for that. So, I mean, just personally, I chose this sort of concepts of, I have it here. It's focusing on physical interactions. So I guess one particular challenge, and just maybe to make it more concrete, I've done a lot of work in the sense of touch. So this probably isn't particularly relevant for jobs related to website design, et cetera. But if it's just focusing on, okay, making new buttons for an iPhone or something, that's way too specialized and I can't change my portfolio every time. So I was like, well, how do you broaden it a little bit? I was like, well, in this particular case, it's applicable to Internet of Things. I spoke to my colleagues. So just in terms of the process, I spoke to colleagues who'd also done grad school with me. I was like, oh, well, some of them are doing Internet of Things work now, some are doing wearables. So that's the way of kind of broadening the scope a little bit, but still being focused. So I think that finding the right amount of focus was something I kind of struggled with a fair bit, and I think it's working relatively well. And I think about these issues has helped a lot for interviews, because then I can describe, oh, here's how this project is relevant for this particular job that might not seem like a match. Then that's, and I guess the other key thing, we're talking about portfolios, but I guess what is the main goal of the portfolio is to, I guess, help get yourself out. So, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about much is when do you not need a portfolio, and what kind of networking can we do outside the portfolio that achieves the same goals or same actions. So I mean, so you have this great timeline here of, okay, where the portfolio can help out in the process. So just thinking back in terms of jobs and interviewing, things that have worked out well is when there's something of true benefit to the community and interacting with others, and then not really expecting something to come out of it, and then something usually does come out of it. So that's kind of, I mean, similar to what we're doing with portfolios, putting yourself out there. So to be concrete, just at dinner we had a conversation of, I remember a company I was at tanked, and then one of the things I did after that was start just a research project with a local university, and on that research project, I chose it to be carefully aligned such that I'd have an opportunity to have a lot of interviews with 6 senior executives at different companies, and then one day I was just trying to do this research gig on the side as well as I could, and one of these execs just invited me for lunch and then didn't let me go for 4 hours and then offered me a job after that. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I just like to throw that out in terms of the context of how can the portfolio and the case studies kind of fit into a broader context, and maybe other ways of accomplishing the same goals of a portfolio. And I'll keep it kind of short and sweet. Those are kind of the key kind of challenges I want to put out there. And I know Wendy has some, or Nancy has some questions in terms of design afterwards, and I guess we'll hand it off. Thank you.
Good, we will open it up to questions, and I know there will be plenty of them. I'm watching, everybody is very rapt, that's exciting. Thank you, Colin. And last but not least, I want to introduce you to Smita Populo, and sorry, I'm getting all the vowels in the wrong places. So Smita has a slightly different way of presenting, and she's recently moved from a UX research job to an interaction design job. So I thought that would be another nice example. Please.
Yes. Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction. So I recently found a job, and I'm now at Intuit. And before this, I was at Citrix Systems for about 8 years. So when I was looking for jobs, it was kind of a very stressful time for me, because I was kind of enjoying, I was very comfortable doing design, research. I knew a lot of people in the company. And because I had done both design and research, I had to decide, where do I want to focus my job searching efforts? And I decided I will go with design because that's my original background. And I ended up putting both sort of types of work on my website. And the biggest lesson I learned building my portfolio was on project management, because I also have a background in front-end development and felt like I needed to hand code my website. And that was, I think, in retrospect, something I should not have done, only because I ended up spending hours and hours trying to update myself on the latest technologies, trying to do, when I was doing front-end development, JavaScript was a lot simpler. Now there's like a million libraries, and I was like, what's the fastest way, but also a way I can achieve my design. So that's one thing that I ended up kind of learning, and I would do differently next time. And I ended up researching a lot of portfolios from my peers, and mostly found design ones. So I'll actually focus on the research side maybe for today, and please feel free to browse what's up there right now. I've done a lot of projects. This only captures like 6 of them, and that's because I had to cut scope. I had to decide, which ones showcase my best work, but also I didn't have like 6 months to kind of go into a lot of detail, so kind of had to decide which ones. And I think what we heard from you guys was also like maybe presented in the form of a case study, because I've also been on the interviewing side, and I tried to think, what do I want to see in, somebody on my team who might be a researcher or a designer. And I felt like I wanted to know their thought process more so than the final deliverable, because I would have to work with them, like almost 100% of my time as a designer. So I put them in terms of case studies. And one thing that I tried to do here was show the breadth of the work, but also go into some of the projects I did a little bit deeper. And because I had a design background, I ended up using a lot of that in my research too. So when I would communicate findings, when I would work with the designers to have an impact on or use the research insights, I would use a lot of examples and ideas on how to kind of use the research. And I also wanted to kind of explain the different types of research that I had a chance to work on. And this was an example that was done almost for 9 months. So there was a lot that went on in this project. And what I tried to do here was, if I was not there in front of the person looking at my portfolio, can they get an idea of what I thought about, the people I worked with, without having me kind of talk through what I did. And I did ask for feedback from a lot of my peers, and this is kind of a result of that. And one of the things that people told me was, as a researcher, a lot of your work is spent working with stakeholders. It's not just coming up with a study guide, conducting the research, and sharing insights. There's a lot of pre-work before you start your research, where you're trying to work with your stakeholders and see what is the right method of research, what is what is the timeline, what is the scope, and kind of guiding them with your research. So I tried to include, how long did this take? Were there other people on the team who were my primary stakeholders? And also, what were the specific research methodologies that I ended up using? And also at a high level, what were the goals? Who were the people that we talked to? And because of, I guess, confidentiality constraints, I did not put exactly the companies and participants and those kinds of details, but enough to give a sense of the scope of the project. And then I put down a summary and tried to talk about the method itself that I had experience with, because I think people were asking a lot of details in my interviews. Why did you do it this way? Why not this way? So this was a way to kind of show the actual artifacts that was used in the research, and some of them were like actual user data as well. And I talked about the research tools I used, why I used them, And this project kind of was really long, so you can scroll and kind of see. And I also tried to include how I did the synthesis of the research, because I felt like that was changing depending on what the project was and what the stakeholders were looking for. And you can see this is how I did some of the synthesis. And at the end of it, there were some artifacts that I had generated so that it's not just specific product findings, but also because this was a longitudinal study, we were trying to understand the life cycle of a product. So I mapped out a day in the life of an IT administrator. And we basically printed this out and put it up in all our global offices so that everybody could see the research, where it could walk them through the user's journey, but also kind of call out some tidbits on, where we can, where there are opportunities for design, what is the pain that they go through, and these are direct customer quotes. So kind of synthesizing everything that we learned and making it a little bit more digestible. And another thing that I ended up doing for this project was, because there was so much data that we were collecting, it was kind of hard to communicate, what do we do with all this data, right? There's so much useful information here. How can we actually apply this to the project? So what ended up happening was I used a metaphor to say the way our users go through using our product is the way they would build a house. They start by setting it up. They imagine a foundation, like a blueprint. And the second part of using the product is building that house, based on the blueprint. And then once they've built the house, they start kind of becoming an expert, or they start settling in, they become comfortable with the product. So, try to explain it with a metaphor so that whenever they look at the findings, they can go back and think about, okay, which stage of the user journey they're in. And I ended up including a bunch of reflections, what I would have done differently. There's some code missing, but yeah. So for each of my projects, I felt like that was an important piece to include. And another example was field visits that I had done. And again, I followed a similar layout of what was my specific role, who did I work with, and the methods I had used. And because each research project is different, the process that I used was also different. Some of the titles and the way I presented the information also ended up changing. I tailored it very specifically to the actual content of research. So I did end up spending a little too much time, I think, creating all these graphics. I made them myself to explain and tell the story. And this is all stuff I had taken out of my research report that I had presented internally when I did the research. And then this is where we had done research, so I kind of, removed details, but enough for you to see how I planned my research. So you can see the way I was thinking about it, some of the activities and some of the findings, what we learned from our customers and our users, and then how I did the synthesis as well. And I tried to write it in I also ended up spending a lot of time kind of writing in a way that if somebody read it, it felt like a blog, right? Kind of like you're talking to me. You'll get enough detail by reading this. And also, in order to kind of show the entire process, because it didn't end with just doing the research, right? It's what was the impact of the research? So there are a lot of artifacts that I used to generate when I did these studies. So I included, how did I end up communicating the story of what we even found? And this is an example of how, based on the results, we had created a storyboard and a video to show the customer's pain, and then also show if we solve this pain, what would the solution be? And then again, reflections. And I'll show you one example of a design project. Sure. So I followed a kind of a similar approach for this one too, where, what is the product, kind of a preview of what it was about. I tried to do different things where I was like, okay, if you just look at the title, what is this about? I just made up these hashtags, I guess. They don't go anywhere. I wish they did. That was another place where I had to cut scope and be like, it's okay, it's, maybe I should just let this be. And some other feedback that I got from my peers was, this is a long page, right? There's a lot of content on here. What if there was a way that said, there are 5 sections on this page. If I could just navigate between the 5 sections, people can just kind of pick and choose, what information they want to see. I didn't have time to do that, so I didn't. But I would have liked to see that if I was, going through someone else's portfolio. And speaking of a summary, I ended up doing this for my design projects where I put down kind of what was my process as a designer when I did this project. So I created a different summary for each project because each project is different to explain, my first step was to work with stakeholders, then come up with scenarios, then come up with workflows, test those workflows, and then we ended up with a design. So kind of explaining what was my process as a designer. So this again follows kind of a case study style with some artifacts and with with a lot of commentary. And examples of before, after, and reflections. So you get the idea. It's pretty similar across the site. But yeah. I'll go back here.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Smita. All right, now it's your turn. I'm guessing some of you may have some questions you'd like to address to the whole group or perhaps to the panelists. And yes, Edwin, please feel free. He's going to be handling the other microphone.
Okay. I have 2 questions actually for Sarah. So one question is, what would you suggest for somebody that moves from, let's say, research position to design, or from something else into research, and then they've done something else previously? What would they show in their portfolio if their previous work examples are not really relevant to the position they're seeking? So that's the first question. And then the second question was, you said that you had 15 in-person interviews, and you were showing that portfolio, and then the follow-up was way less. So can you speak, do you think the portfolio was part of that, or was not related?
Yeah, so let's see, the first question, what I would say, if the work isn't relevant, to not show it. I think it's a little bit confusing when people see work that's, they're expecting to see work for the job that you are hoping to see. If you don't have the work, is that part of the question? Like if you don't have a research project or design project, and that's what the role you're looking for, make one up. There's so many opportunities out there to just, I'm going to design a better version of this thing, or I'm going to do a guerrilla usability study on the thing that I use the most that drives me crazy. And so there, it definitely takes some effort to do that, but that's what I would say. And I really struggled because people kept wanting to, oh, but you're a designer. It's like, no, I'm going into research. So that's why I took down most of my design stuff from my website, because people kept seeing it and oh, I want to interview for your design role. No, that's not what I'm looking for. So that was my experience there. And just to clarify, my interviews, when I had 15 initial interviews, a lot of those were phone interviews. So it might be with just before the in-person interviews. But so it was only 4 where I was brought in and I actually presented work.
Yeah, I would add to the first question. I have an engineering background and technical, so there are a lot of engineering jobs in programming, so I removed all of that from my portfolio, and I'm still getting questions like, hey, be an engineer. But to reiterate, right now I'm actually trying to do some different types of research projects. So I've trying to collaborate with a company and offering kind of reduced rate to build up an example. And I'm iterating with this client at the reduced rate until I find something that provides really good value for them, and then I can use that as a case study is kind of how I'm building up. So I'm not sure that seems to be a way to
Okay, so we heard two ideas there. So Sarah says, generate your own project if you don't have relevant work. And the second one is offer yourself at a reduced rate, but with the willingness of the company to know that you're going to publicize your work with them, assuming it works out well. Smita.
Yeah, so actually that's a really good question, because I went through this too, where portfolio was one piece of it, but once the company decided to have you come on site, there's an in-person portfolio review typically. And that's where I felt like I had a really good opportunity to cater that portfolio presentation to the job. So there's a bunch of work on here that I ended up presenting on site that was mobile, that was IoT-based stuff, but it wasn't in my portfolio. And I felt like I used the portfolio to just kind of say, this is the type of work and these are my skills generally. And people were actually very open when I presented work that was not here, but that covered something that was specific to that company or that industry. So I would say there's two parts to the portfolio itself that at least
So you have the shown portfolio and the hidden portfolio that's only revealed if we invite you on site.
And yeah, on that note, all my in-person portfolios showed totally different projects than what was in my published portfolio, except for one when I interviewed at a health tech company and I showed my thesis because it was around health. So.
Right. Okay, I hadn't heard that little hint before. I think that's a good one. Yes. You have something?
So actually, kind of building on that question, so when you're in the process of choosing which projects actually make it into your portfolio, did you have any sort of selecting strategies? I mean, right now I'm in that process and it seems like there's one way of doing it that might shows many different methodologies that I've used, or there's another one I'm interested in going into health, so I show all of the health-related projects and I kind of ignore the other tech projects I might have worked on. Do you have any opinions on editorial and selection?
I'm probably am I the most scattered of the group? I thought a lot about focusing. I went for breadth. One challenge I've had is some verticals seem to be more insistent on showing examples in that vertical. So health seems to come up, but when I talk to like a health company, they want to see you've done a lot of health examples versus in some types of market research. They don't really care about the vertical and they can modify the skills appropriately. So I tried to think about, okay, which potential targets are most receptive to transferable skills. So I know health was often more picky, so that's why I chose one health example. And then I also looked at breadth. So I didn't mention, in terms of intellectual property is something that's very difficult to often convey, but I kind of I wanted to show that as a strength. So there was one patent that had already been issued. So I thought, okay, well, I'll get some images from there and I can kind of use that as a stepping stone. So one thing is that my examples are really short because I've been more concerned about confidentiality. So I'm hoping that, okay, it's enough to show interest to get me in the door, and then I have all these other more detailed case studies, et cetera, that I can use in an in-person interview. And that's what I'm trying to deal with. You had this long timeline and your portfolios across the timeline. Mine's kind of more brief, so further down the interview process, it's not really helping much, so that I have other material.
Well, I just want to say I think that's such a great approach. I mean, I think the big thing people come to your portfolio looking for is like, does this person know what they're doing? And they want to know that you're respecting confidentiality. And I always, there were projects I'd present that I would anonymize it to a certain degree, and I would say, I'm only showing you some part, and people totally want to hear that. Will want to hear that you're editing what you show because of confidentiality. So I think that's why it's a great approach, and I'm assuming that people generally are like, oh yeah, this person really knows what they're doing. I have enough to see the level of expertise. They don't really necessarily need to know all the details. So I think it's a great approach. And just one more thing about that question is I was always struggling when I was doing my in-person interviews. They'd usually say, oh, we want to see 2 case studies. Like, oh, what are the right range? So I'd usually do kind of one evaluative and one generative. but it was really dependent on the company. The closest I had to what that company was is what I would show, because people want to see what they do.
All right, now, let's go for the other side of the room.
Hello, everybody. I have a question for you as designers and researchers. So don't you think that the portfolio itself is a product, and you can deal with portfolio as with any other product? You have users, you have user needs, you may have scenarios. Why not to deal with your portfolio as a product for your users, who would be HR people, CEOs of the company, different sort of owners of startups, and all other guys? Do you have any understanding of their needs to think about this product not from perspective that you would like to show off, but from perspective what they want to see from you?
I've talked to I guess hiring managers, and so through friends or colleagues, shown to a hiring manager. So as the hiring manager, what is kind of your opinions? So I mean, I think that's part of it. It probably, you had this kind of junior, mid-level, and kind of senior breakdown too, Sarah. So I think that would depend a lot on that breakdown.
And when I was prepping for my class, I interviewed about a dozen people who were hiring managers, and so that my list of kind of the things to show kind of the process and that stuff came out of what I heard people wanted to hear. And I think you talked a lot about this too. I mean, both of you. It's like just talk about your decisions and not really focus so much on the final outcome.
That's right. Yeah, I think as I kept interviewing, both with recruiters, but also hiring managers, but also people who were screening me to bring you on site, people were really interested in the decisions that you were making and how did those decisions impact the design and what you learned from them. And one common question was also, what would you do differently? So I think that reflection area was something that people actually said, hey, I'm glad you put down your reflections because then I know what you learned from doing this. And from knowing what our users are, right? Like as an interviewee, what are people who are hiring and companies who are hiring looking for? I personally felt like they wanted to know whether you had the hard skills. That was a given. Like your portfolio is of course a product of what you can do. So the way you present it and what you're talking about, you need to know, like if you're a researcher, you need to know your methods, you need to know, all of those things. And as a designer, you should have some aesthetic sense. But apart from that, it was a thought process, I think, that people were interested in. I felt like.
I think one particular challenge is focusing. So I'm interested in some research scientist positions, which they want to see sort of participation in scholarly journals and want to see publications. So I have this publications tab over the right, but most of the jobs are going to be in industry, and if you kind of have academic publications, like, oh, you're too scholarly, we're not interested in that. So that's a kind of careful balance. So, I mean, I thought about that balance. I don't know if I've addressed it well, but I think trying to figure out, okay, what's my primary brand? Even if I'm interested in these three areas, what's my primary focus? And then with the process that you're suggesting, just is, okay, we'll ignore these other ones. And anyway.
Yeah, and based on, actually another thing I realized halfway into my process was some companies were interested in looking at the final product, like they expected some kind of a demo on the website. Or when you went to present it, they wanted to see the whole flow and then kind of speak to the process. So depending on who, I felt like the needs and the expectations were quite different. So there was a lot of customizing and catering based on the job, I felt like. And I definitely made a separate presentation for every job I applied.
My question is also about the balance of the case studies that you highlight. Part of the question would be, how many case studies would you highlight on your website? And if you have your top 3 projects that you're most proud of, would you put them on your website portfolio, or would you keep them for the in-person interviews? Like, how do you decide what you use how?
It just depends. I just have this rule of thumb. Okay, I didn't want a list greater than like 6 or 7, just because I don't want a huge, overwhelming list. I don't think there's a. I mean, it depends on the breadth. I don't think it really matters in terms of if there's something you want to highlight in an interview. I don't think that. I think it's fine to be on the portfolio too, because in an interview you can go in more depth, and even if you have a very long case study like this one you both presented, then there's still additional depth and additional questions of what issues came up when you had such and such with a stakeholder, and then you can actually dive into deeper questions and show your strengths better. So I don't see a problem with. Having multiple information.
Yeah, I actually documented my portfolio creating process. I wish I brought my sketches and my computer with me, but in terms of deciding, for me, I just wrote down all the projects I had done, and I grouped them into which ones are full product designs, which ones are redesigns, which ones are just conceptual, never got shipped, which ones were short-term, which ones were long-term, and then I had to make another sub-categorization of what do I want to do next? And based on that, I put up, okay, this reflects what I want to do next, so people know that I can do this. And that's how I kind of decided which ones to put up and discard the other ones. Because I was also trying to apply for lead positions, and I felt like when I was interviewing, they wanted not just like really cool designs, but also a lot of other skills associated with being a lead designer. So that's why I was like, which ones can show that what I want to do, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it kind of depends a little bit on, and this is part of what you're hearing, on whether you're a researcher or designer. And I think as a designer, which one are you? Or Yeah. So to me, I think as a researcher, I think you really only need 2 or 3 projects on your website as a portfolio, just to show, yes, I have the skills. And then you're going to probably customize. You might have a set of 6 or 10 that you might cycle through in your in-person presentations that are very different. I mean, my in-person presentations I gutted so much of it. I just really highlighted and made it a super punchy and exciting, left out so much of the detail and left room for people to ask questions is kind of what I learned about my in-person presentations. But so I think you don't need a ton, just, because really for me, I was like, I'm getting interviews, so the portfolio is doing its job. And then I could talk about them, but you kind of got to figure out if you like making them, if they're helpful for you. Maybe you go ahead and just every time you present one in person, you add it to your website. So it really depends on kind of, what works for you.
I guess even naming the techniques, and one of the pieces of feedback I got from this group with the initial bio, I had all these techniques like cognitive walkthrough, think aloud, blah, blah, blah. I just want to hit them all. But then the feedback I got was, oh, that's too long and for the bio. So I thought, well, I should put that in with the portfolio. So some kind of summary of the techniques then can help, I guess, make hits for the HR people. And then you can have fewer of the actual case studies. I think that helps in terms of the language used too. So I purposely use more technical language because I'm aiming more at the sort of hiring manager and the technical people, versus say if I was doing consulting, then on a consulting website, I'd probably want a completely different language that's focused on the business value and the impact, and not use any of the user research or design research jargon. So that's one thing I've mentioned before.
Hi, I'm right here. I have 2 related questions. One is, for those of us who are not necessarily versed in website design, what forms can a portfolio take other than a website, if any, or what would you recommend for that? And the other one is, given confidentiality concerns, where do you draw the line in terms of what you can show? And if you can't show a lot of visual stuff, what kind of visual stuff do you replace it with so it's not all a bunch of text?
So I have no knowledge whatsoever. Mine's just done using Wix. My 14-year-old son helped me do it. So if that can work, it seems to get the job done. I purposely didn't, I mean, I have some wonderful designer friends, but I think that's probably good enough. I could have confidentially, yeah, my background's in the sense of touch, so that makes it really hard to visually show anything. So I struggled with that a lot, but I mean, that's where, in terms of partnering, as I mentioned before, partnering with marketing people, salespeople, what kind of collateral do you have available from your past projects? I mean, there's got to be some, so, and especially just partnering with others in past jobs, and usually pretty helpful in terms of giving suggestions and material.
And can I ask if you're a designer or a researcher? Okay, yeah. I think with a researcher, I mean, designers, of course, have to have website examples, because that's what they're designing. But I think with researcher, you can have a template. I was just talking to a PhD student who's moving into industry, and she started using Google Slides. And so anything. I mean, I think she's just sending PDFs. That's what I did. I had it in PDF. So it's really whatever you're comfortable with that you can send it easily. So, so anyway, I think easy is totally fine. And then the confidentiality, I think here's the thing, what I sense, especially I'm talking to a lot of my students are like, oh, I can't do anything with it. Well, sit down and try. Take that project you did and go ahead and make a draft and see what you feel comfortable that you could share. How could you, because I had a colleague who she made amazing case studies out of projects that were confidential because she was able to kind of add enough color around the topic, and it wasn't about what the findings were. It was kind of about scoping. This is what I was responsible for. This is what we did. We made an impact. So I was like, wow, that's an amazing website considering that you were able to anonymize all this stuff. But the other thing I want to say about that is the best practices really is to talk to your employer when you start a job and just kind of upfront, like, hey, what is the policy here around how I can share my work? I mean, you can talk about it at any point, but if you've been there for 3 years, then you start asking about portfolio, then they might get the sense you're starting to look. So it's usually best, but I think that's a great conversation to have at the beginning of any job especially, and kind of, because, I had a boss who was like, she's like, you just don't share the details, but you can kind of generally talk about some of the projects and, but some people have very different practices. And of course, companies like Google are very like nothing. You can't share anything that happens here outside. And they also really are wanting to know, like, are you sure you're not showing us anything that is confidential? So lots of sensitivities around that, but also some creative ways. Just sit down and try it. And of course, the question is, at what point do you feel comfortable? Like, okay, I have really anonymized this. What you really should do is kind of share it with the person who you did that with. If it was confidential, say, are you comfortable with this? That really is, of course, the best thing to do.
So let's look at the press releases. I mean, I worked on this, it was like an alpha prototype of an Xbox controller, and it was highly confidential, but we'd presented it at CES. So I went through the marketing materials from that CES presentation and then focused on the process, and the combination of those two was enough that seems to get enough traction, even though it's highly confidential. I can't really talk about anything else. So.
Notice how he starts whispering. Kishori.
Yeah, hi. As researchers, we need to be advocates of the user insights that we come up with. So when you're sharing your portfolio, if you were asked, how were you a good advocate, or how were you persuasive with the insights you came up with? Can you share some insights and tell us more about it? Some of your, best practices or tips of how you do user insights advocacy.
So you're saying if we were applying for jobs and they wanted to know how are you advocating for
like
these
how
users?
are you a good advocate of the insights you've come up with?
Oh,
what are some things that have worked for you in your work process? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I feel like I have gotten that question.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've talked about is kind of creative deliverables that will kind of socialize research findings to not just the stakeholders but the entire team. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of one thing I've talked about. You guys have other ways you've answered that?
I guess sort of trying to train salespeople and other stakeholders in usability methods, and that's kind of a way of building buy-in, et cetera, and sort of increasing insights. So that's one thing that comes up.
Yeah, I think depending on the project, one thing that I had done was, what was the before and after? And that was directly like because of an outside-in perspective, because of making sure that you're focused on the user. It's not about the team. It's we're building the best product for the user. So before and after was one, but also one was based on the research, we felt like we needed to change certain things, and we were able to measure, in some cases we were able to measure and say this increased by this much. Like our SAS score, for example, increased by this much, or we had these many more users sign up and there was more uptake because we made this because of what we found in our data. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just going to say relative to that, because I find that in many projects, in order to make an impact, you do have to engage stakeholders. And I actually build those into the research plans and have done some pretty extensive repetition of it, depending on what's needed. But actually creating activities where you bring stakeholders in and deal with a project when it's a little bit raw, when things are a little more plastic, and when they can give feedback into the process, makes it much easier for them to consume that at the end, right? And with some clients, we delivered one workshop with my team, and we ended up kind of going on a road show. We ended up doing workshops for 2 or 3 weeks and extended the project in order to socialize it that much more, but it really made a big impact. So that's one of the things I think is pretty helpful.
That's great, yeah. Great.
To build on my question, I actually have an example where I was trying to find the match, There's like qualitative research and there's quantitative. I'm more heavy on qualitative. And I think I remember this scenario where I was trying to talk through about, how I persuaded and how I was an advocate. And my educational background was more qualitative, where we talked a lot about how the emotions, helped, and how, like, metaphorically. But as I went through in my work experience, I saw that things like SAS scores or quantitative thing worked. So I think when I went through the interview, I kind of felt that the qualitative would not work, and I left it out. I think I'm thinking about how to understand what to showcase, and how to understand the beat of the person that we're talking to, and yeah.
Yeah, so actually that's a good point. I think I misunderstood what you were asking earlier. We're going through that right now, where we're conducting research, but because qualitative might focus more on the generative side of things, right, or the phase of research, it was like the way our researcher has been doing it is everybody had their own idea, but because of the research, now we all have a common idea, and of who our users are. So it's helping kind of narrow and get closer to our users, whereas before we were, very presumptuous. We were putting ourselves in the user's shoes, but you don't want to do that. The user is not like you. So kind of giving those examples of how the team was able to use your data and be like, they were always referencing what we found in the data. They'd be like, oh, from when we interviewed Scott said this, right? Or when we interviewed, somebody else. So when they start using the research data for themselves to explain themselves, I feel like that's one way. But as far as presenting in a portfolio, I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe it's like you say, the direction changed, or the team's understanding, narrowed, or something like that.
I've tried to highlight some process improvements, like especially in a sense of touch and deal with manufacturing. Some processes have been, say if it takes tens of thousands of dollars and several months of processes, then using some modified rapid technique, can I get that down to, say, a week and a few $100s of sort of hardware expenditure, and that kind of resonates. So that's not really a sort of really qualitative or quantitative user research result, but it's showing that a commitment to driving value in the UX process. So I guess one example. I guess how different things resonate for different people too. Like if a project has been shown by a senior executive at like CS or something trade show, then there's also not really a quantitative number associated with that, but there must be some perceived value within the organization at a large extent for that to happen. So let's try to be creative with the different techniques.
Okay, we got another one. Let me just say that among the notes that I had in advance were, what if I don't have any specific experience in the job that I'm going for? And you've started to talk about that. What's the role? I didn't have this, I don't know if we covered this. What's the role of internships or volunteering or short-term classes? And how do you, is that a thing you would want to incorporate into your portfolio? And then I'll go on to a little more. So think about that while we get this next question.
Thank you very much for the information. It's very timely for me. Something that you brought up, I think, Smith, that you brought it up first, was that it's not just the portfolio site, but we may also have to be prepared to have a companion piece that we bring with us to the in-person. Is that as an additional part of the same site? Are we talking about flavors of a site? Are we talking about creating a deck, which I'm sure we're all very adept at doing, that we bring with us?
I ended up creating a deck because that was easy to modify based on what you wanted to show. And it also captured a little bit more in detail, not just the work, but also about your experience, your background, maybe your approach, where you could add a little bit more commentary and build the story. So I think a deck was a really good way to do it in person, and mimic what you would have done as a researcher to your stakeholders. So that way I think it was easier to do that.
Yeah, one of the nice things about decks is you can modify it faster, or you coded it from scratch, so it takes a lot more time to do any kind of modification, so it's an advantage to really tailor to the audience.
Yeah, and towards the end I felt like I was sending out PDFs of my deck and not sending them to my portfolio, because that was so much easier to kind of customize. So I did upload like a PDF and said, just go here, enter this password. Yeah.
And I just want to know what were you getting out of that customized deck that you weren't getting out of your website? You're able to kind of customize based on what you knew they wanted?
That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It was only 1 or 2 projects that applied to the exact position, going in depth a little bit. But I felt like, if you have a site, to modify it, to test it. I went crazy when I was like, I need to make this work on a mobile device too. Don't go down that route.
Yeah. I was actually one of the hiring managers of one of the creative leads at Material. I was talking to him about this when I was working on my class, and I was like, well, do you want students to design students to code their own website? He's like, no, that's ridiculous. No one should be coding their own website anymore. It's like, of course I expect them to use a really nice template. So anyway,
well, I did want to do the template,
Yeah.
But when I was looking for inspiration, I felt like on Wix or some other websites, it was hard to differentiate between different designers. I was like, wait, how do I kind of distinguish the work that I've done and all of that based on the presentation? So I was like, let me bite the bullet this time. But in retrospect, maybe not next time.
So Sarah and Smita, both of you have stressed the importance of customized presentations, especially when it's on-site. Maybe it's like you customize according to the research method that the company is looking for, or product versus process. But how do you know what they want, especially when it's the first interview and you can't gather much from the job description? So.
Well, when you're talking to somebody, I mean, by the time I'm going in and presenting something in person, I would have talked to them probably at least the hiring manager once, and I'm going to have gleaned a lot of insights about what they want and what they value. So that's kind of, but I overall for me, that year-long job search, I got to be very intuitive about being able to pull out kind of the details of what people were looking for through my interviews. And that was, I was having all these interviews that weren't going to the second interview, and I was like, what's going wrong? I know something's wrong with my interview skills. And I'm just a compulsive note taker anyway, because I'm a researcher, but started kind of really analyzing my notes after the interview and what answers did I not nail? And then I started kind of really thinking about what would be a better answer to that. And I just, you just kind of develop that sense. But it takes a few interviews to really get that sense. So, you have to make your best guess, and this is, especially people who are new in the field, you make your best guess and you just be really self-reflective afterwards and think about what clues did I miss, or where do I think that went wrong? But it sounds like you developed a really strong intuitive sense about what they were looking for. So that you just have to be listening and responding.
Iterate and focus on the next step too. And so if it's just with the first hiring or before the hiring manager, just the recruiting screen, then you can be a little bit broader and you're just trying to get to the hiring manager. And once you're a hiring manager, you should be able to get feedback from the questions with the recruiter to tailor a little bit more. And then once you get the on-sites, there's fewer of those, so then you can tailor even more specific and spend a lot more time. So just iterate seems important.
Yeah, I did ask the recruiter typically, what is the team looking for? And I would specifically write them and be like, do you want to see process? Do you want to see at final? Do you want to see, ask the hiring manager.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and they would always respond. They tell you what they want to see. Do you want to see a demo? Do you want to see, what would the hiring manager care about? And if it went to the hiring manager stage, I would ask the hiring manager, what do you want to see, right? And that was really helpful. And I only started doing that after a couple of interviews, so I kind of had to figure that out and be like, let me just ask you, right?
Gosh, you can ask directly and they'll tell you. An amazing thing. I think Sabina had a question. Is that true? Wait for the mic. Okay.
So what was I going to ask? All right.
It's on. It's on. You can talk.
It's not. I don't know. So actually, I'm still struggling with the confidentiality. I'm still struggling with the confidentiality of how much I can divulge of what I've done, and some of the products I've worked on, they've been launched, but I'm still not 100% sure how much I can talk about it. I can take now screenshots basically from the products, but still I'm struggling with in what detail. And I'm fine with toning it down when I'm just talking about it on my resume or something, but when you go in and you talk to the team, it's I don't know. It's really hard, especially if you get asked questions on the spot, to kind of how much can you say without crossing any boundaries. So I'm still, I don't know, I still have.
I guess I noticed on one of your slides you had a crossroad, almost like a highlighter. I did that for one presentation where I think I took out 60-70% of the actual content, but then I could walk through in the actual interview the process. And I think someone was talking about in terms of the hiring manager, often you're focused on the process rather than the content. And I was kind of hesitant, I'm just chopping out way too much content, and it's not just going to seem too flaky, but it actually came across and it seemed to resonate with them quite well, because they were able to understand the process and that answered their questions of how it could apply to their industry. They have different content than the last job anyway, so it seemed to be okay.
Yeah, definitely blurring out anything that's identifiable to the product or company. And if it's like company logos, I cut it out. If it was gonna say, this is like, I was working at Apple and this was something, I just took out the logo, just made it black and white.
But that means that you still have real decks and stuff that you did.
So the real,
I don't think, I mean, if I
Not
look at the
public.
contracts that I have, I was not allowed to take anything with me. So, you know, I have to recreate basically from scratch. So I don't know how you deal with it. Does it mean that you are taking it anyway, or?
Being proactive helps. I mean, it's very difficult after the fact because after you've left a company and then going back and say, oh, can I have access to something? They're going to say no. This is a pain. So I think being as proactive as you can, of just working with whoever you can to get as much collateral seems to be the easiest bet.
And I'm assuming you're a researcher, not a designer? Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, this is such a good advice I got when I was prepping for my Google interview from a friend who was there. She said, you know, you're not there to, you know, you are the product that you're selling here. They want to know about your decisions, your thinking. So, you know, whatever project you're going to show them, it's not really about what the recommendations you made for that project. It's about that you had recommendations, that you were able to have impact on the product. And you know, so that's, you know, yeah. But I agree, it's tricky, it's hard. I think you just got to play with it. I think that's what I hear people do a lot is they talk about, oh, I don't know what to do. But I'm like, have you really sat down and spent an hour or two working on how you can anonymize that? Like, do that, and then kind of show it to some people. You know, then get your feedback from your friends, your colleagues, and be like, does this still make sense? Because, you know, we have these big holes. Like, to you, it may be like, oh, this is nothing. But maybe somebody else is like, oh, yeah, this really sells that you were decisive and you made an impact and you drove this. I don't really care what the content was. For you, that might feel like there's nothing here. So.
Thank you. So I've noticed that we have not mentioned, although Sarah sort of touched on it, and I've been reading various recommendations about portfolios in the last week. Can you imagine? So, you know, what happens if you're an incoming new person? What happens if you're a mid-career person? And what happens if you're a senior person? How many and what type of projects? And especially, we haven't touched on, though, if you're senior and you're going for a leadership position. Now, two of you talked about that sort of. What do you show? So it's like your old portfolio doesn't work anymore in some ways if you want to go for a director or VP position.
Well, you know, I don't think people have portfolios at that level. That's actually, I was working on those slides and I was like, you know, yeah, the senior people that I know don't have portfolios. That's for junior people. So that's my kind of observation. I'd love to hear from other people. You know, I mean, it definitely makes sense if you're new in the field, you know, if you're looking for an individual contributor role. But once you're leadership, you're just you can tell your stories and you have a track record and, you know people in the industry.
yeah, I think in some cases people didn't ask for like work. Sometimes they ask you to do a design exercise or a research exercise, do homework. With some companies, when it was a manager or a lead position, they didn't ask for that. They were like, just get on the phone and talk about what you did, more than show what you did.
I think one challenge maybe on the junior side, straight out of the college, would be the kind of academic divide in terms of, okay, you might have academic course projects, but as we often know, there's a pretty big divide in terms of what you do in a sort of human-computer interaction or a user research course, and then how that applies in a company. So that's where, I mean, if there's kind of volunteer work, et cetera, and maybe at least have a mixture. So, I mean, if someone is coming straight from college and I'm interviewing someone, then it's in the back of my head, okay, how can this be applied? But if there's at least maybe one or two more sort of industry relevant, if it's sort of nonprofit, or you've just, I know someone where they just went to like General Assembly or before doing that, they decided to just interview a whole bunch of people on the bus in the Muni or something in San Francisco with a bunch of friends, and they did this research project and they showed that as a case study, and it took them like a week or 2 weeks, and that was something that was more concrete and industry relevant.
So that's create your own design brief, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking about Billy Mandel, who's somebody who is a design leader. She starts design teams. she taught at General Assembly, and she has a great talk about what is the benefit of junior designers, what junior designers bring to the table. And she came and spoke to my class, and I'm just realizing she has a really good website where she's kind of promoting and selling her leadership skills. So
Say the name again.
Her name is Billy Mandel.
Okay.
I forget if it's Mandell. It might be 2 L's. But anyway, I suppose if you are really looking to pivot into a leadership role, you are going to need to have some kind of online presence to kind of really, kind of show your track record. But I just think there's a lot more flexibility there about, and just, it's not so much about case studies about the team that you built more than about, a project that you led. So, and at that point, you're probably speaking a lot in public, so links to that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Links to industry trade show presentations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the clock behind us, or behind you, ahead of me, and it's that time. So I'm going to say thank you to all of our speakers, and please come down and talk to them. But 2 things I want to say to the audience. One, if you are on the website, I'm in the Google group, Design and User Research, please, everybody, post something about this. What did you take away from this conversation that contributes back to Wendy Castleman's question originally? She couldn't come. She lives 3 hours away. I'm substituting for her. I wanted her to be the moderator, but the travel was too much.